Greetings, everyone. This is Danny Pang, and today I'll be continuing to watch the part two of the Emu Wars Battlebirds by Extra History. In the last episode, the Australian government in 1932, uh, the farmers of Australia were bothered by these emus who were destroying their crops, and they asked the government for help, and the government prepared three soldiers, two machine guns, and 10,000 rounds to destroy, or at least to reduce the number of the emus to save the farmers, as well as some good old government propaganda to show how competent they are. And let's see how that goes.
Western Australia, November 2nd, 1932. For months, the soldiers turned wheat farmers of Campion and Wagulin have suffered the depredations of the terrible emu. After a vigorous mating season, the gangly, rambunctious birds had migrated west, dashing their massive bodies against wire fences until they fell, then trampling the precious crops under the ecstatic dance of their sharp claws. With conventional methods of bird deterrence failing, the farmers found themselves chasing down flocks of emus in their cars and on bicycles, waving sticks at the birds who were so gleefully wiping out their livelihoods by spraying urine across hard-grown rows of wheat. But there were so many emu, and they were so fast, all seemed lost. That is, until a transport came over the horizon, carrying 3 soldiers from the 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery and 2 mighty machine guns. Ah, yes! The farmers rejoiced. Perhaps they had lost the emu battle, but today was the dawn
Fight
of the
night.
emu war. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. At 45 years old, Major Gwyneth Meredith had seen some action, but not often against birds. Compared to the violence of the Great
Not often, so he had seen some actions against birds.
War, he considered this campaign more like a zoo visit. And it's fairly easy, though not pretty, and, let's be honest, basically a dick move for a machine gun-toting soldier to shoot animals at a zoo. Meredith's plan was to herd the emus together for quick killing, because while his Lewis guns were powerful, they were cumbersome and not easily mobile. So with the farmer's help, he and his 2 soldiers attempted to shepherd a couple dozen emus into range of the guns. But the birds were not so easily corralled. Chased by Meredith, the flock split into smaller groups and fled, running away at 30 miles an hour. This might be harder than he thought. But surely not harder than fighting an enemy battalion or an aircraft. The targets these guns were designed to shoot. These were birds, and the bigger the bird, the easier it should be to hit with a machine gun, right? Well, most folks thought so anyway. In fact, Meredith's superiors, right up to the Minister of Defense, had been so confident in the success of the mission that they'd sent a cameraman to capture propaganda footage of the culling and a request for 100 emu skins to make nice new hats for the boys back home. Thankfully, the following 2 days brought better luck. Meredith's guns downed a couple of targets, though this made no difference to emu morale, and the birds continued their devastation of the fields. Seeing this, Meredith had an epiphany. If he was going to deliver on expectations, he needed to start making bigger moves. So he planned an ambush at an emu watering hole. And this time, 1,000 emus walked into his trap. But when Meredith gave the order to fire, the machine guns jammed. Good thing the camera crew was there. By the time they cleared the jam, engaged the enemy, and held their breath for the dust to settle, the vaunted tools of modern war had killed only 12 emus. More were wounded, sure, but undeterred by the bullets lodged in their surprisingly tough hides, most managed to escape. Meredith couldn't believe how much punishment an emu could take without going down. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world, he said. They can face machine gun fire with the invulnerability of tanks. Then the farmers shared their own hard-won wisdom. There's only one way to kill an emu. Shoot him through the back of the head.
How?
But Meredith would have to catch them first. Giving up his ambush tactics,
Yeah, it's easier to say than done. I mean, the birds, though they are big, but they're not that big, and their heads are even smaller. They're a smaller target than a human head. How are you supposed to, fire them right in the head? Ridiculous.
he mounted a gun on a truck and chased the emus down. But the birds were still faster, and the ground too bumpy for the gunner to shoot with any accuracy. Also, by now, the birds were keeping to smaller groups, almost strategically, almost as though they had a leader. In each pack,
Who
the
says they
soldiers
didn't?
observed a, quote, big black-plumed bird, which stands fully 6 feet high and keeps watch while his mates carry out their work of destruction and warns them of our approach. And it was at this moment of despair, a moment in which one comes to believe in the existence of an emu commander and intelligence chief, that Meredith and his men were ordered back home immediately. Just as things were getting worse, and the emus were descending in greater force upon Campion, had mighty Australia surrendered. Meanwhile, in Parliament, members had been asking the Prime Minister uncomfortable questions, like was an emu war really the best way to deal with a pest control problem? Who was paying for it? Oh, and also, wasn't all of this just incredibly silly? Yes. Yes, it was. In Parliament, the opposition called it a farce, and the press reported that the emus were more than holding their own in the war, which I think we can all agree is a very bad look. So George Pierce, the Minister of Defense, officially declared the emu war over, with only 300 birds dead. Turns out, nobody in the army would be getting any new hats after all. This decision, while politically expedient...
Well, couldn't they at least make 300 new hats for 300 people?
...was terrible news for the settlers of Campion and Wagulin, whereas the emus, now emboldened, continued their ravages. So once again, the farmers begged for assistance, dispatching urgent telegrams from the very much still active battlefront. Emus beginning reappear large numbers, wired one farmer in Campion, and from Wagulin. We urgently desire Lewis gun crew to assist here. Enormous number of emus doing untold damage. All right, back to square one then. Almost. Because what the farmers had now was an ally, a convert in Major Gwyneth Meredith, for he had been transformed by what he'd seen in the West. The damage done by these birds has to be seen to be believed, Meredith protested to his superiors. Sitting behind one's desk, he said, one could not imagine the horrors of the emu war. The birds were nigh invulnerable and poised to bring Australia to the brink of agricultural catastrophe. They needed to be stopped. He needed to stop them. And so, in the interest of agriculture, Pierce agreed to redeploy Meredith and his men to the front lines, in an attempt to bring an honorable end, once and for all, to the emu war. November 13th, 1932. Many men fear emasculation, but few know how it feels to be emasculated by an emu that is emusculated. Meredith, by contrast, had been emusculated hard by the big birds in a theater of war. So now his response was to drown the desert in blood. His first day back, Meredith killed 40 emus, and by December, he and his men were putting down 100 a week. As he did, George Pierce was asked in Parliament, was there not a more humane method to cull the troublesome emus? Poison, perhaps? Maybe stronger fences? To which Pierce replied that he thought machine guns were pretty humane. On December 10th, 1932, they declared
poisons were the most poison were inhumane, so were machine guns. You can't say machine guns were the most humane way to kill defenseless birds. Come on.
Their mission accomplished. Meredith and his soldiers returned home in triumph, claiming to have killed 986 emus, with a further 2,500 mortally wounded. The emu war had been won by the humans. Australian humans. I mean, who's to say how any other nation would have done? And yet, once the belligerence and bloodlust had diminished with time, people still did think, you know, that was very silly. And George Pierce's enemies never let him forget it, calling him the minister for the emu war, even as he specifically never brought it up again. There are many officials and experts who can't bear to be reminded of some of their more ambitious efforts at emu destruction, wrote Sydney's Sunday Herald years later. And sure, it's embarrassing to be shown up by a bunch of emus, but maybe it's more embarrassing to get so worked up about it that you try to drive an entire species to near extinction with high-caliber automatic weapons. Or was the most embarrassing thing of all that it wasn't enough? The emus returned time and time again to Campion and Wagulin, their feathers laden with lead, but figuratively unruffled. And when the farmers petitioned the government for another emu war, the answer this time was no. Not a problem, the farmers said. What if we just dropped bombs on them instead? You know, like from a plane. Again, a hard no. Unwarranted was the word they used. So in the end, nobody got what they wanted. By supporting the Emu War, George Pierce had hoped to quell a secession movement in the state of Western Australia. But in 1933, the state went ahead and voted for it anyway, only to be told by the United Kingdom that secession was illegal. And shortly thereafter, Western Australia voted Pierce out of his Senate seat. And in just a few decades, neglected by central government, the towns of Campion and Waugalan withered up
Oh
and
no.
died. Campion today is a ghost town. No wheat, no farmers, no soldiers, nothing. Well, except maybe you'll see an emu or two. A little slower now, you know? A little grayer. Just pecking and peeing at the lone desert sands where there was once a town. One can only imagine a single thought crossing their bird brains. Peck around and find out. But don't worry, fellow human. Just because the birds won the...
Well, I suppose that concludes the Emu Wars Battlebirds by Extra History. It was a very, very interesting and fun video to watch. Two, part 1 and 2. It did bring a lot of new information, more than the video from of Oversimplified. The video by Oversimplified was also very, very fun. You should watch this and that. So, but the ending of the two explanations of the Emu Wars were quite different, because in this one, it talked about the ruination of the town Campion and Mulligan, while in Oversimplified's one, I think it mostly talked about how Pierce said he won the Emu War without any further explanations. But this one, it actually talked about how the Emu successfully drove the humans out of these two towns, and in my opinion, they had won. They occupied the two towns, and the humans could do nothing to stop them. Or the humans didn't consider them a big enough threat to deploy more armaments to go against them. Well, anyway, it was worth watching this, as well as the Oversimplified one. I now know a lot more about this war against the emus, and I'll see you guys in the next video.